The Russian Empire didn't die in 1991. It died in August 2025, and almost nobody noticed the exact moment the heart stopped beating. We are witnessing the most catastrophic geopolitical collapse of the 21st century, and it isn't happening on the front lines of Ukraine. It is happening in the South Caucasus, the very backyard Vladimir Putin once considered untouchable. For 30 years, Moscow held the leash, freezing conflicts to guarantee obedience. But that leash didn't just snap. It was cut, burned, and thrown away. The humiliation is absolute. Azerbaijan hasn't just drifted away. They have blocked Russian oil from their ports and are structurally converting their entire military to NATO standards. This is not a drill. A former Soviet state is adopting NATO doctrine, NATO logistics, and NATO ammunition while actively dismantling Russian influence. Meanwhile, Armenia, Moscow's historic security dependent, has openly declared Russia a traitor and turned its face toward Washington. The ultimate sign of this collapse? The 2025 peace deal. It wasn't signed in the Kremlin. It was brokered by the United States. When Washington becomes the guarantor of peace in the Caucasus, Russia ceases to be a superpower. Putin invaded Ukraine to stop NATO's expansion, yet his failure has pushed the entire region into the arms of the West. The frozen conflict strategy has backfired into a total structural meltdown. From the oil terminals of Baku to the ammunition factories of Serbia, the message is clear. The king has no clothes, and the alliances are dead. The era of Russian dominance is over. If you believe this is the beginning of the end for Russia's global influence, comment 1 below. Let's talk about the New World Order. The collapse of Moscow's imperial ambition in the South Caucasus did not begin with a bang, but with a long, agonizing silence that eventually shattered the spine of Russian authority. When Azerbaijan moved to block Russian oil from its ports and simultaneously pushed its military toward full NATO interoperability, it was not merely a diplomatic pivot. It was the visible, measurable, and irreversible disintegration of a sphere of influence that Vladimir Putin had viewed as untouchable. This was a structural shift, a tectonic plate moving beneath the geopolitical surface, exposing the extent to which Russia's power had rotted from within. To understand the magnitude of this failure, one must look past the headlines of today and stare into the abyss of the last 3 decades, where a strategy built on cynicism and manipulation finally ran out of time. For 30 years, the Kremlin did not seek peace in this volatile region. It sought paralysis. The Russian strategy was engineered around the concept of the frozen conflict, a calculated geopolitical purgatory where war was suspended but never resolved, ensuring that both Armenia and Azerbaijan remained trapped in a web of dependency. Russia positioned itself as the indispensable warden of this prison, the only guarantor of stability, arming both sides to ensure that neither could ever fully walk away from Moscow's grip. It was a masterclass in imperial control, trading conditional protection for absolute loyalty, a system where peace was treated not as a goal, but as a threat to Russian leverage. This arrangement, cold and efficient, worked until the very moment the foundation cracked. The illusion of Russian omnipotence was shattered in 2020, when the geopolitical temperature rose and the frozen conflict melted in the heat of modern warfare. Azerbaijan, backed by Turkish technology and armed with 21st century drone warfare capabilities, launched an offensive that the sluggish, Soviet-style thinking of the past could not counter. The balance of power, carefully curated by Moscow for decades, was obliterated in weeks. Russia, the self-proclaimed protector, stepped in only when the outcome was already decided, deploying peacekeepers to Nagorno-Karabakh not to save its ally, but to salvage what little relevance it had left. It was the first major tremor, a signal to the world that Russia's security guarantees were conditional, unreliable, and entirely dependent on the Kremlin's shrinking bandwidth. Armenia felt the shockwave of this realization deeply, but the true historical rupture, the moment the knife was twisted, arrived in 2023. This was the year the pretense of Russian protection evaporated completely. When Azerbaijan blockaded the Lashin corridor, the sole lifeline connecting Armenia to the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, the region was plunged into a humanitarian nightmare. This was not a minor border dispute. It was a siege. For months, 120,000 people were cut off from food, fuel and medicine, slowly suffocating while Russian peacekeepers, stationed there specifically to guarantee open access, stood by and watched. The silence from Moscow during the blockade was deafening. It was a silence that spoke louder than any speech Putin could have delivered. The Kremlin issued no meaningful demands, applied no real pressure, and offered no resistance as the noose tightened. Consumed by its own disastrous invasion of Ukraine and bleeding political capital on the global stage, Russia simply ceased to function as a great power in the Caucasus. The betrayal was absolute. Inside Armenia, the realization took hold that their historic patron was not just distracted, but impotent. The breaking point, sharp and inevitable, came in September 2023. When Azerbaijan launched a lightning military operation that overwhelmed the remaining Armenian forces in Nagorno-Karabakh in a single day. 3 decades of Armenian control and 3 decades of Russian mediation dissolved in 24 hours. The Russian peacekeepers, the supposed enforcers of the status quo, did not fire a shot. They stepped aside, rendering themselves obsolete in real time. For Yerevan, this was not just a military defeat, it was a harsh awakening to the reality that the emperor had no clothes. Russia had promised a shield and delivered a mirage. The aftermath was a rapid, angry realignment of history. Armenia, feeling the bitter cold of abandonment, froze its participation in the CSTO, the alliance meant to be Russia's answer to NATO, and openly declared Moscow an unreliable partner. The veil had been lifted. The South Caucasus, a region that served as a symbol of post-Soviet authority, was no longer listening to orders from the Kremlin. By the time the United States stepped in to broker a peace deal in August 2025, the geopolitical landscape had been irrevocably altered. The sight of the American president signing as a witness to peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan was the final nail in the coffin of Russian hegemony. It signified that Washington, not Moscow, was now the guarantor of stability in the region. This was a strategic disaster for Russia, a loss of face so profound that it cannot be spun or propagandized away. The Kremlin had lost control of the narrative, lost control of the territory, and, most damningly, lost the fear and respect that once kept its neighbors in line. The vacuum Russia left behind is now being filled by Western institutions and NATO standards, a transformation that proves a simple, brutal truth. Power abhors a vacuum, and loyalty cannot be maintained by a patron who is too weak to offer protection and too compromised to uphold its promises. Most of the world barely paid attention to the signing ceremony in Washington, viewing it as just another diplomatic formality. But for the Kremlin, that image was a strategic disaster that signaled the total disintegration of its post-Soviet authority. The South Caucasus was never just a region to Moscow. It was a symbol of its enduring reach, a testament to the idea that even after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia remained the indispensable hegemon. If the United States could successfully resolve a conflict that Moscow had kept frozen for 30 years, it meant that Russia no longer controlled the narrative, no longer held the keys to peace, and no longer possessed the gravity to keep its neighbors in orbit. While Armenia's political shift westward was expected given the betrayals of the recent past, the far more destabilizing development, the one that fundamentally alters the military architecture of Eurasia, came from Azerbaijan. Baku began a process that is far more dangerous to Russian interests than any treaty: the conversion of its entire armed forces to NATO standards. This move is not merely rhetorical or symbolic. It is a profound structural overhaul that rips the Azerbaijani military out of the Russian ecosystem and grafts it onto the terrifying efficiency of the Western war machine. Converting to NATO standards means adopting NATO terminology, standardizing ammunition calibers, aligning communication systems, integrating complex logistics, learning Western operational doctrine, and training officers at NATO academies. It means the Azerbaijani soldier stops thinking in Russian and starts fighting like an extension of the Atlantic Alliance. This transformation renders the Azerbaijani military interoperable with NATO forces, not Russian ones, making future joint operations a tangible reality and giving Baku the option to apply for membership with the technical barriers already demolished. Most importantly, it signals a permanent strategic choice that Azerbaijan believes its long-term security and partnerships lie with the West, turning its back on the chaotic and decaying security architecture of the Russian Federation. Then came the economic rupture, a calculated strike at Russia's financial jugular at a moment of extreme vulnerability. Azerbaijan announced that it would no longer handle sanctioned Russian oil and banned Lukoil from using the vital port of Baku. This was more than a business decision. It was a severance of the logistical arteries that Moscow relies on to circumvent Western sanctions. Russia depends on logistical flexibility to move its crude to shadow markets, and cutting off Baku is a serious blow, a denial of access that forces Moscow into costlier, more desperate alternatives. Russia responded in the way it always does, with denials mixed with impotent pressure. But the dynamic had shifted. When an attack struck the Azerbaijani embassy in Kiev, President Aliyev did not mince words, telling Vladimir Zelensky that this was not the first time Russian forces had targeted their diplomatic mission. Moscow insisted it was an accident, but the timing was cited by observers as deeply suspicious, a clumsy message sent by a power that no longer has the capacity to intimidate. The Kremlin's frustration boiled over when Aliyev publicly lectured Moscow, stating that Ukraine should not waste time on military solutions because Russian potential is bigger. A statement dripping with sarcasm given the context of Russia's struggles, essentially mocking the Kremlin's inability to close the deal in its own war. The unraveling did not stop in the Caucasus. The contagion of defiance spread to the very heart of Russia's perceived friendship in Europe. Even Serbia, Russia's closest partner and historical brother, began shifting its weight. In a move that stunned Russian nationalists, Serbia announced it was ready to supply ammunition to Europe, fully aware that Europe was free to deliver it to Ukraine. Serbia produces large volumes of artillery shells, the very lifeblood of the war of attrition in the Donbass, and had previously assured Russia that none would reach Ukrainian hands. Those assurances evaporated. Russian officials issued strong, almost desperate objections, with one stating refusal to even discuss the possibility that Russian soldiers would be killed with Serbian ammunition. Yet the frustration was unmistakable and entirely futile. Countries that once echoed Moscow's worldview are no longer willing to protect Russian interests at the cost of their own economic and political future. Across Eurasia, the pattern is becoming impossible to deny. Armenia is leaving. Azerbaijan is NATO aligning, Serbia is distancing, and Central Asian states are diversifying. This transformation matters profoundly because the South Caucasus sits at the absolute crossroads of global power. It is the gateway to Caspian energy, a corridor for European diversification, a junction for China's Belt and Road routes, and a sensitive border with Iran. Russia's collapse here weakens everything it once projected: military dominance, political influence, and diplomatic necessity. It exposes the naked truth that the Kremlin can no longer enforce red lines, cannot guarantee the security of its allies, and cannot prevent Western institutions from entering its former backyard. The irony is sharp and devastating. Putin invaded Ukraine to stop NATO's expansion, to push back the borders of the West. Instead, NATO grew. Finland and Sweden joined. Ukraine deepened its ties. And now the South Caucasus, long seen as the soft underbelly of the Russian Federation, is moving decisively toward Western systems. Russia did not lose its sphere of influence because others stole it in the night. It lost it because it failed to offer what it promised: reliable security, stable diplomacy, and strategic foresight. When the guarantees collapsed, so did the alliances. The realignment has begun. And the question is no longer if Russia can regain its footing, but how far the geopolitical unraveling will spread, and which region of the post-Soviet world will be the next to realize that the emperor is gone. This transformation is not a localized political shift. It is a geopolitical earthquake that shatters the illusion of Russian indispensability in the most critical corridor of the Eurasian landmass. The South Caucasus is not merely a collection of small nations. It is the absolute gateway to Caspian energy, a vital artery for European diversification, a critical junction for China's Belt and Road Initiative, and the volatile northern border of Iran. For Turkey, this region is the natural extension of its security ecosystem. For the United States, it is a strategic anchor utilized to stabilize a volatile frontier. And for the European Union, it represents the only viable energy supply line that bypasses Moscow. By losing its grip here, Russia does not just lose territory, it loses the leverage that allowed it to hold the world hostage. The collapse of the Kremlin's authority in this region weakens every pillar of power it once projected, stripping away the facade of military dominance, eroding its political influence, and exposing its diplomatic irrelevance. It demonstrates to the world, in real time, that the Kremlin can no longer enforce its red lines, cannot guarantee the security of its allies, and is powerless to prevent Western institutions from setting up camp in its former backyard. The strategic irony of this moment is sharp enough to draw blood. Vladimir Putin launched a catastrophic invasion of Ukraine with the stated goal of halting NATO's expansion and pushing the Western alliance back from Russia's borders. Instead, he has achieved the exact opposite, accelerating the very encirclement he sought to prevent. NATO did not shrink, it grew, adding Finland and Sweden to its ranks, while Ukraine deepened its integration with the alliance's systems. And now, the South Caucasus, a region long viewed as a captive satellite within Moscow's orbit, is decisively moving toward Western standards and Western protection. This is the ultimate paradox of the Putin era. In trying to resurrect an empire, he has accelerated its disintegration. Russia did not lose its sphere of influence because the West stole it in a covert operation. It lost it because it failed to offer the most basic requirements of hegemony: reliable security, stable diplomacy, and strategic foresight. When the guarantees collapsed, the alliances dissolved. Nations that once depended on Russia are discovering they no longer have to. And that realization is the most dangerous weapon of all. The realignment has already begun, and the momentum is irreversible. This leads to the haunting question that every analyst in Moscow must now confront. If the South Caucasus has slipped away, which region will be the next to cut the cord? How far will this geopolitical unraveling spread before the Kremlin realizes that fear is no longer a currency that buys loyalty? The path taken by Armenia and Azerbaijan is not an anomaly. It is a blueprint for the rest of the post-Soviet world. The empire is not being conquered from the outside. It is being abandoned from the inside, leaving Russia isolated in a world that has moved on without it. The realignment has already begun, and it is moving with a velocity that defies the stagnant history of the last century. The collapse in the South Caucasus is not merely a diplomatic defeat. It is the first domino in a chain reaction that threatens to sweep across the entirety of the post-Soviet space. The logic of empire relies entirely on the perception of inevitability, the unshakable belief that no matter how hard a satellite state fights, the center will always hold, and the prodigal son will always be forced to return. But the center has failed, and the sons are leaving for good. The events in Armenia and Azerbaijan have sent a shockwave through Central Asia, where nations like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are watching with calculated predatory interest. They see a Russia that is distracted, depleted, and incapable of projecting power beyond its immediate, blood-soaked front line in Ukraine. They see a Russia that abandons its treaty allies to be overrun, a Russia that cannot protect its own vital trade routes, and a Russia whose military red lines are crossed with absolute impunity. If the South Caucasus, a region intimately tied to Russian history, culture, and security, can break free and integrate with Western military standards, then the psychological barrier for the rest of the former Soviet Union has been obliterated. The gravitational pull of Moscow is being replaced by the centrifugal force of national survival. Leaders in Astana, Tashkent, and Bishkek are taking detailed notes on this collapse. They are realizing that the price of defying Moscow is manageable, while the price of relying on Moscow is catastrophic. The architecture of the Russian world is crumbling because its foundation was built on a geopolitical reality that no longer exists. A reality where Russia was the only game in town. That monopoly is over. We are entering a new era where the term post-Soviet ceases to define the future of these nations. They are no longer defined by who they once belonged to. They are defining themselves by who they choose to partner with next. The unraveling is total, systemic, and ignoring it will not stop the bleeding. Russia is left standing alone in the ruins of its own diplomacy, shouting orders that no one obeys and making threats that no one fears. The fear, which was the currency of the Kremlin's influence, has been devalued to zero. And that leads us to the final, inescapable question that now haunts the darkened corridors of power in the Kremlin. If the South Caucasus is gone, who is next? How far will this geopolitical unraveling spread before the Russian Federation itself begins to fray at the edges? Is there any realistic path for Moscow to regain the influence it spent decades building? Or are we witnessing the slow, grinding death of the last European empire? The answer is already being written in the capitals of Eurasia, and for the first time in centuries, it is not being written in Russian. The map of Eurasia has been redrawn, not with ink, but with the cold, hard reality of national survival. And the final verdict is that Russia is no longer the architect of its own neighborhood. We are witnessing the grand finale of the post-Soviet stagnation, a period where Moscow relied on the ghosts of the past to govern the living, only to find that the living have finally decided to bury the dead. The collapse of influence in the South Caucasus is the ultimate indictment of a foreign policy built entirely on coercion rather than cooperation, on the arrogance of assuming that these nations had nowhere else to go. They did have somewhere else to go, and the moment the door cracked open, they sprinted through it without looking back. This is the strategic bankruptcy of the modern Russian state laid bare for the world to see. It is a bankruptcy of ideas, of resources, and of trust. The peace treaty signed in Washington was not just a diplomatic agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It was the death certificate of the Russian sphere of influence, signed by the very people who were supposed to be its subjects. History is rarely kind to empires that refuse to acknowledge their own decline, and the price of this denial is absolute isolation. By failing to adapt, by failing to offer a vision of the future that was more compelling than the misery of the past, the Kremlin has turned itself into a relic in real time. The South Caucasus was the test case, the canary in the coal mine, and the silence coming from the mine shaft indicates that the air has run out. The region is now integrating into a global system that operates on rules, commerce, and alliances that Russia cannot compete with, leaving Moscow to guard a perimeter that no longer exists. The tragedy for Russia is that this was entirely preventable, a wound self-inflicted by a leadership obsessed with 19th century imperialism in a 21st century world. They squeezed too hard, and the sand slipped through their fingers. Now, as Azerbaijani officers learn NATO protocols and Armenian diplomats walk the halls of Western capitals, the reality sets in that the near abroad is no longer near, and it is certainly no longer abroad. It is simply gone. The geopolitical center of gravity has shifted irrevocably. What remains is a Russia that is smaller, lonelier, and infinitely more vulnerable than it was before it decided to break the world order. The South Caucasus has proven that the Russian orbit is not a destiny, but a choice, and it is a choice that is being rejected with contempt. As we look at the trajectory of these nations, we are no longer asking what Russia will do to stop them, because we know the answer is nothing. The question has changed. We are now asking what a post-Russian Eurasia looks like, and the answer is already forming before our eyes. It looks stable, it looks Western-aligned, and it looks like a future where Moscow is nothing more than a neighbor with a nuclear arsenal and a history book that no one wants to read. The empire has not just fallen, it has been evicted.